Before there was order, there was only power. Before there was Olympus, there was only rule without balance. In that age, the world belonged to the Titans, and above them, all ruled Cronus. He was not always a tyrant. He began as a victor, a son who overthrew his own father to take control of existence itself. But victory does not always bring freedom. Sometimes it creates fear, and fear can reshape even a god. It began with a prophecy, a warning that did not arrive like a voice, but like certainty embedded into reality itself. One day, one of Cronus's children would overthrow him, not challenge him, not wound him, end him completely. That idea did not leave him. It stayed, it grew, and slowly it replaced everything else he once was. At first, Cronus tried to ignore it. He ruled. He commanded. He shaped the world beneath him. But every time a child was born, the prophecy returned stronger. Each birth felt less like joy and more like confirmation of doom. So he made a choice that would define an entire age. He would not allow the prophecy to grow. He would consume it before it could act. And so it began. Each time Rhea gave birth, Cronus was there, waiting, watching, and without hesitation, he swallowed the child whole. Not out of anger, not out of hatred, but out of certainty that control was the only way to survive fate. One by one, the children disappeared into him, their presence erased from the world before they could learn what existence meant. And inside Cronus, something strange began to happen. He did not feel lighter. He felt heavier, as if each swallowed child added weight not just to his body, but to his mind, to his awareness, to his fear. The world outside continued to exist. The Titans ruled without resistance. But inside Cronus, there was no peace, only silence filled with possibility. Rhea watched this unfold again and again. Each time a child was taken, something inside her broke a little more, not loudly, not in visible collapse, but in slow internal erosion. She no longer saw birth as joy. She saw it as loss delayed by seconds. And then it happened again. Another child. Another moment where Cronus arrived with certainty in his eyes. But this time something changed. Rhea could not allow it to continue. Not again. Not this time. So when Zeus was born, she did something different. She did not resist with force. She resisted with deception. She hid the child before Cronus could see him. Deep within the world where Titan eyes did not reach. A place of silence and concealment. And when Cronus came, she gave him something else. A stone wrapped in cloth. It looked real enough. It felt real enough. And Cronus did not hesitate. He swallowed it. Just like the others, just like before, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to relief. He believed the cycle had been preserved. He believed the future had been contained. He believed he had won. But prophecy is not something that can be eaten. It only waits. Inside the hidden world, Zeus was growing, not in the presence of his father, not under the shadow of the Titan who feared him, but in silence, in concealment, in absence of everything he should have known. Zeus did not yet understand what he was. He did not yet understand what had been taken from him. But even in hidden form, something about him felt different, as if he carried weight that had not yet been revealed. He grew away from the world that ruled above him, raised in secrecy, protected by forces that resisted Cronus without open war. And in that isolation, something began forming within him. Not fear, not submission, but awareness. A quiet sense that existence extended far beyond the space he occupied. Above him, Cronus continued to rule, unchallenged, unquestioned, believing silence meant safety. But beneath that silence, something impossible was already alive. Not yet rebellion, not yet war, but inevitability. And inevitability does not announce itself. It simply waits until the moment it becomes undeniable. The world of the Titans was built on certainty, but certainty built on fear always contains cracks. Cronus believed he had closed every path fate could take. He believed swallowing his children was the same as removing the future itself. But fate does not disappear when it is contained. It adapts. It waits inside the shape it has been forced into, and it finds another way out. Deep within the world, far from the throne of the Titans, Zeus continued to grow, hidden from the eyes of the god who would have destroyed him. He did not know the full truth of his existence, only fragments of it, a sense that the place he lived in was not the world itself, but a place designed to keep something out, or perhaps to keep him in. There was no normal childhood for him, no public name spoken in reverence, no lineage told openly. Everything around him was shaped by concealment, by silence that had purpose. And in that silence, he learned to observe, to listen more than he spoke, to notice patterns in the world that others might ignore. Above him, the rule of Cronus continued unchanged. Each swallowed child remained inside the Titan god, not dead, not alive, but present in a way that defied natural order. And that presence slowly became unbearable. It is one thing to remove your enemies. It is another to carry them inside you forever. Cronus began to feel them, not as voices, but as pressure, as weight, as unease that had no source he could locate. He had believed swallowing them would end prophecy. Instead, it had buried it inside himself, and now it was becoming harder to ignore. Rhea watched him from a distance. Rhea had not found peace in Zeus's survival. She had only delayed disaster. Every moment she lived with the secret child felt like tension stretched too far. She knew Cronus would not remain ignorant forever. A god who consumes his future cannot remain untouched by it. So she prepared for what would come next. But preparation against a titan is not simple planning. It is endurance. It is waiting for inevitability to reveal its shape. Zeus, in the hidden world, began to change, not physically in any dramatic sense, but internally. There was something in him that resisted stillness, a sense that confinement was not natural, that silence had weight it was not meant to carry forever. He began to ask questions without knowing who he was asking them to. Why the world above felt unreachable, why the space he lived in felt like protection built from fear, why he sensed something vast existed beyond his boundaries. There were no answers given to him directly, but answers in myth are rarely spoken. They are revealed through consequence, and consequence was approaching. Far above, Cronus's fear continued to grow. What had begun as control was now becoming instability. The children inside him were no longer silent in the way he expected. Something about their presence was shifting his perception of reality itself. Time felt uneven. Thoughts felt heavier. The certainty he once ruled with began to fracture at the edges. He did not yet understand why, but he could feel that something inside him was no longer under control. And fear, once established, does not remain isolated. It spreads. It affects decisions. It alters behavior. It makes even gods unstable. The universe was beginning to bend around that instability, and Zeus, still hidden from sight, was unknowingly at the center of it. Rhea understood that the moment of truth would not remain distant. So she acted again, not to destroy Cronus, not yet, but to prepare the conditions that would eventually make him vulnerable. Zeus would not remain hidden forever. The world itself was beginning to push against the secrecy that had protected him, because prophecy does not remain buried. It grows until it forces itself into reality. And when that moment arrives, concealment becomes impossible. Only change remains. And change, begun, cannot be reversed. Silence is never empty. It only hides what has not yet spoken. Deep within the hidden world, Zeus began to feel that silence shift. Not suddenly, not violently, but like something inside reality itself was becoming aware of him. He had grown without a name spoken openly, without a throne, without recognition. Yet something in him refused to remain small. There were moments when the air around him seemed to respond to his presence, subtle at first, a pressure in the atmosphere, a stillness that arrived when he was near. Then something more, a sense that the world was not fully separate from his will. He did not understand it, not yet, but he felt it. Above him, the reign of Cronus continued, but it was no longer stable in the way it once was. The Titan god who once believed himself absolute now carried something inside him that resisted containment. The swallowed children were no longer passive. They had become weight. They had become presence. And that presence began to shape him from within. Cronus grew restless, not in action, but in thought. He began to sense that something was wrong, something that could not be seen but could not be ignored. And fear, once buried, does not stay buried for long. It returns in fragments, in uncertainty, in hesitation where there was once certainty. Back in concealment, Zeus began to change in a different way, not through growth of body, but through awareness. There were moments when he would act without understanding why. A stone would shift when he moved. A branch would crack without force. A pressure would rise in the air around him when emotion sharpened. It was not control. Not yet. It was emergence. Something inside him was beginning to respond to his state of being. The world was reacting to him in ways it did not react to others, and that realization began to form slowly inside his mind, that he was not simply hidden, he was contained, protected from something, or protected for something. The difference between those two truths was not yet clear, but it mattered. He began to sense that the world above him was not just distant, it was structured, layered, controlled by forces far beyond the space he occupied. And yet something about him did not belong to confinement. There was a tension inside him that grew whenever he felt limitation. Not anger, not rebellion, but inevitability, as if stillness itself was incompatible with what he was becoming. Rhea observed this transformation with both hope and fear. Rhea knew that hiding Zeus had not stopped prophecy. It had only delayed its expression, and delay is not safety. It is accumulation. She understood that the longer Zeus remained hidden, the more pressure would build in both worlds, inside Cronus and inside the future that waited beneath him. Zeus was no longer just a child protected from fate. He was becoming the shape of fate itself, and that change could not remain contained forever. Above them, Cronus's instability deepened. He began to notice things that could not be explained, dreams that felt like memory, sensations that felt like awareness of something inside him that was not his own. The children he had swallowed were no longer silent. They were becoming presence, not voices he could hear, but forces he could feel. And that feeling began to fracture his certainty. A god who fears prophecy does not become stronger with time. He becomes unstable, and instability spreads outward, through thought, through action, through the structure of reality itself. Zeus, still hidden, was now no longer simply growing. He was aligning, not with knowledge, but with nature. Something inside him was becoming aware that existence itself had direction, and that direction was not random. It was converging towards something that had been building long before he was born. He did not yet understand war. He did not yet understand rebellion, but he understood pressure, and pressure always seeks release. Above him, the world of Titans was beginning to crack at its foundation, not because it was attacked, but because it was never meant to remain unchanged forever. And in that crack, something was preparing to rise, not as accident, not as mistake, but as consequence. Nothing in the world changes all at once, even when it feels sudden, even when it feels like rupture. Change begins long before it is visible. Deep within the hidden places of the world, Zeus began to move differently, not physically at first, but in presence, in awareness, in the way reality seemed to respond when he was no longer passive. There were moments when storms in distant skies shifted without reason, when winds changed direction without warning, when the ground beneath him felt less fixed than it once had. He did not yet understand these things as power, only as coincidence that repeated too often to ignore. Above him, the reign of Cronus continued to fracture in ways unseen by most. The Titan god still ruled, still commanded, still believed himself secure. But security built on fear does not remain stable. It begins to react to its own instability, and Cronus was no longer stable. The presence of what he had swallowed was becoming unbearable. Not in sound, not in form, but in pressure. It felt as if something inside him was pressing outward from places he could not locate. Moments of silence became heavier. Moments of thought became uncertain. And in that uncertainty, fear returned, not as prophecy, but as sensation. Something is wrong. Something is changing. Something is inside him that should not be there. He did not yet understand that he had been carrying the future within his own body all along. Meanwhile, Zeus began to experience something new. Choice. It did not arrive as declaration. It arrived as tension. Moments where he felt the world could move in more than one direction. Moments where stillness felt optional rather than imposed. And in those moments, something inside him leaned toward movement, toward resistance, toward change. Rhea observed this shift carefully. Rhea understood that hidden power does not remain neutral. It grows toward expression, and expression, in a world ruled by fear, becomes disruption. She began to see Zeus not as a hidden child anymore, but as a future that had already begun to breathe. And that future was no longer contained by distance alone. Zeus started to notice patterns he could not explain. When he felt strong emotion, the world reacted subtly. When frustration rose, something in the environment tightened. When calm returned, space around him softened. It was not control, not yet, but reflection of something deeper, a link between internal state and external world, something that did not exist for ordinary beings, only for those tied to forces larger than themselves. And slowly, without instruction, he began to test it, not consciously as experimentation, but instinctively. A stone shifted slightly when he focused. A breeze moved through still air when his attention sharpened. Small things, almost invisible, but undeniable when repeated. Each moment added weight to something he could not yet name, that he was not simply living within the world. The world was responding to him. Above him, Cronus's fear was now turning into behavior. He began to act unpredictably, more cautious, more paranoid. The titans around him began to feel the shift in their king. Authority that once felt absolute now felt unstable, and instability spreads through power structures like disease. No one speaks it aloud, but everyone feels it. Zeus, still hidden, was becoming the center of a tension he had not yet stepped into, not because he chose it, but because existence itself was converging around him. There are moments in myth where hidden forces begin to align, not toward peace, but toward inevitability. And that alignment had begun. A child hidden from the world was no longer simply surviving it. He was beginning to shape the conditions under which it would eventually change. And change, once it begins to form in silence, does not remain silent for long. Order built on fear never stands still. It only waits for the moment it begins to crack. The world ruled by Cronus had always appeared stable from a distance. The Titans held dominion over sky, sea, and earth. Their authority shaped existence itself. But beneath that surface, something was shifting. Slowly at first, then with increasing weight. Cronus could feel it, not as a clear thought, but as persistent unease. The presence inside him had grown heavier over time. What he had swallowed no longer felt contained. It felt active, as if the boundaries he once believed absolute were no longer sufficient. The silence inside him had turned into pressure, and pressure always demands release. He began to move differently. He spoke less with certainty. He watched more than he acted. The other Titans noticed. They did not speak of it openly, but power always communicates without words, and they understood their king was no longer untouched by doubt. Elsewhere, unseen by him, the conditions that would challenge his rule were already forming. Zeus was no longer only a hidden presence. He had become something closer to convergence, a point where change gathered without yet expressing itself fully. The world around him reacted in subtle ways that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Wind responded to emotion. Space shifted in quiet alignment with intention. Even silence felt different when he was present. Not emptier, tighter, as if reality itself was holding its breath. Rhea understood this better than anyone. Rhea knew that concealment could no longer remain the final strategy. The world was no longer stable enough to hold secrecy without consequence. Every delay increased pressure. Every passing moment made the eventual breaking more severe. And so she began to prepare for what could no longer be avoided. Not openly, not yet, but through subtle movement across hidden paths of the world. Because the structure of Titan rule was no longer unshakable, it was beginning to respond to its own instability. Cronus's fear had grown into something more dangerous than fear itself. Paranoia. And paranoia in a ruler becomes law. He began to question everything around him, not directly, but instinctively. He looked at the Titans beside him and felt distance where there had once been certainty. He looked at the world beneath him and felt resistance where there had once been submission. Even time itself seemed less predictable than before. He did not yet understand why, but something inside him was no longer aligned with the world he ruled, and that misalignment was growing. Meanwhile, Zeus continued to change in silence. There was now a rhythm forming between him and the world. When he moved with intention, the environment responded, not dramatically, but consistently. A pressure in the air when focus sharpened, a subtle shift in atmosphere when emotion intensified. It was as if the world was learning him, and he was learning it in return. He did not yet call it power. He did not yet call it control. But something inside him had begun to recognize pattern. And pattern is the first language of influence. Rhea saw it clearly now. The hidden child was no longer simply surviving fate. He was beginning to define the conditions of it. And definition always precedes transformation above them. Cronus's instability reached a point where silence could no longer contain it. The swallowed gods inside him were no longer just present. They had become imbalance, and imbalance cannot remain internal forever. It pushes outward. It alters decision. It distorts perception. The Titan order was no longer simply weakening. It was beginning to fracture in ways that would soon become visible to all. And when that fracture becomes visible, it can no longer be contained, only confronted. There are moments in history when something hidden stops being passive. It does not announce itself. It does not declare arrival. It simply begins to act. Deep within the concealed world, Zeus reached such a moment. What had once been instinct became direction. What had once been reaction became influence. The world around him no longer felt separate in the same way. It responded, not fully, not openly, but enough that denial was no longer possible. He could feel it most in silence. When everything around him settled, there was still something moving beneath it. A tension in the air, a readiness in space itself, as if reality was waiting for him to decide what it would become. Above him, the Titan world continued to destabilize. Cronus was no longer the same ruler who once acted with complete certainty. His fear had evolved into something far more corrosive. He no longer trusted what he saw. He no longer trusted what he felt. Even the idea of his own strength had become uncertain, and uncertainty inside a god spreads outward like poison. He began to tighten control over everything around him, not because he felt strong, but because he no longer did. The Titans sensed it. They did not rebel, not yet, but they began to shift in subtle ways. Distance replacing loyalty, silence replacing trust. Rhea observed all of this from the edges of the world. Rhea understood that the structure of Titan rule was now past the point of silent preservation. It was entering collapse through tension alone, and Zeus was no longer just a hidden factor in that collapse. He was becoming its center of gravity. Within him, something new had fully formed. Not power in the traditional sense, but awareness of influence. He began to understand that intention mattered, that focus shaped response, that the world did not simply exist around him, it adjusted itself in relation to him, and that realization changed everything. Because once a being understands it is part of the system it lives in, it also understands it can affect it. Small things became consistent. A shift in wind when emotion rose, a tightening of space when focus sharpened, a stillness that arrived when thought deepened. None of it was absolute, but all of it was real. And repetition turns observation into truth. Zeus did not yet seek conflict, but something inside him was no longer compatible with confinement. He began to move with more certainty, not outwardly dramatic, but internally decisive. Each moment of awareness built towards something larger, something inevitable. Rhea saw the change complete itself in silence. There was no longer doubt in what Zeus was becoming. He was no longer only protected from fate. He was beginning to embody it. And fate, once embodied, cannot remain hidden forever. Above them, Cronus reached a point where his rule no longer felt like dominance, felt like maintenance, something that required constant effort to hold together. And anything that requires constant effort is already beginning to fail. He did not know where the failure would come from, only that it was approaching, unseen, unspoken, unavoidable. The world of Titans was no longer stable. It was only waiting for the moment pressure would become rupture. And in that silence before rupture, all paths begin to converge, even those hidden beneath the world itself. There are moments when a path stops being possibility and becomes direction, not chosen, not debated, simply inevitable. Zeus had reached such a moment. What had grown within him was no longer passive awareness. It had become motion, not outward war yet, but internal refusal to remain unchanged. The world around him still hid him, still protected him in silence. But silence no longer felt like shelter. It felt like delay, and delay always carries pressure. He could feel the imbalance in everything above him. The Titan world was no longer steady. It was reactive, uncertain, strained. Cronus ruled still, but his rule was no longer effortless. Every action now felt like resistance against something unseen. Every moment of control felt temporary rather than eternal. And gods are not meant to feel temporary. They are meant to feel absolute. That loss of absolution was the beginning of fracture. Inside Zeus, something deeper shifted. He began to understand that influence was not accidental. It followed intention. When he focused, the world responded with subtle alignment. When emotion rose, space itself seemed to adjust, not dramatically, but consistently enough that it could no longer be ignored. He was no longer simply inside the world. He was interacting with its structure, and that realization changed the nature of his existence. Rhea watched this transformation with growing certainty. Rhea understood that concealment had finished its purpose. What remained was transition. Zeus could no longer remain hidden without consequence, because what was forming inside him was no longer a child protected from fate. It was fate learning how to act. Above them, Cronus's instability deepened further. The presence of what he had swallowed no longer remained internal in the way he once believed. It felt like pressure from every direction at once. Time felt uneven. Thought felt intrusive. Even silence felt unstable. He began to act more harshly, more decisively, not because he was stronger, but because he was losing the ability to feel secure. And insecurity in a ruler becomes expansion of control. But control that expands under fear is not stable control. It is reaction, and reaction cannot last forever. Zeus began to move differently now, not physically leaving his place of concealment, but mentally crossing boundaries that once held him still. He began to understand patterns of resistance, patterns of imbalance, patterns of response between will and environment, and slowly he learned something that would define everything that followed. The world did not resist him equally. It responded, which meant it could be influenced, not by force, but by alignment. This was not yet war, but it was the beginning of understanding what war would require. Rhea sensed the threshold approaching, the point where hidden existence would no longer be enough to contain what Zeus had become. The world above was reaching critical instability. Cronus's fear was no longer contained within him. It was shaping his decisions, shaping the world beneath his rule, and shaping the conditions under which he would eventually be confronted. Everything was now aligned toward a single breaking point. Not sudden, not chaotic, but precise. And inevitability does not rush. It arrives exactly when every condition has been met. There are moments in myth when pressure stops being invisible and becomes history. The world above had reached that moment. The reign of Cronus no longer felt unshakable. It felt strained, like something massive holding itself together out of habit rather than strength. Even among the Titans, certainty was fading. They still obeyed. But obedience without belief is only delay. And delay is the first stage of collapse. Deep beneath that crumbling order, Zeus stood at the edge of something irreversible. What had once been awareness had become decision, not spoken, not declared, but formed. A direction that no longer allowed return. The world around him no longer felt like concealment. It felt like waiting, as if every moment before this had been preparation for movement that could no longer be avoided. Above him, Cronus felt it too. The pressure inside him had become unbearable. What he had swallowed was no longer silent. It was presence, and presence that cannot be removed becomes confrontation. He began to act with increasing instability. He tightened his rule over the Titans. He questioned loyalty where none had been questioned before. He searched for threats not yet visible. Because fear always assumes what has not yet arrived is already near. And in doing so, he created instability where there had only been uncertainty. That instability spread. The Titan world began to fracture, not through attack, but through reaction. And reaction always produces ripple. Rhea understood that the moment of concealment had ended. Rhea no longer saw Zeus as hidden survival. She saw him as convergence. Everything had been moving toward this point without interruption. The hidden child was no longer separate from the world above. He was part of its correction. Zeus began to feel it before it fully formed, not as instruction, but as alignment between thought and inevitability. He understood now that resistance was not about force, it was about timing, and timing was now complete. The Titan world was no longer stable enough to maintain itself. It had become a structure held together by fear of collapse rather than strength. And structures like that do not endure confrontation. They trigger it. The first fractures appeared among the Titans themselves. Old alliances weakened. Trust dissolved into suspicion. Even immortals began to feel the weight of uncertainty. and uncertainty in divine beings becomes physical reality over time, the world itself began to respond. Storms without cause, shifts in sky and sea, tension in the natural order that mirrored the instability of its rulers. Zeus stepped closer to understanding what he was becoming part of. Not a hidden force anymore, but a necessary one. Something that did not exist outside the system, but emerged from it when imbalance became too great to remain uncorrected. The line between hidden existence and open conflict had thinned to almost nothing. And once that line disappears, what remains is action. Above all, Cronus finally understood something he had refused to see. The future he feared was not coming from outside. It was already inside the world he controlled, and it was no longer silent. It was ready. There is a moment when fear can no longer be contained, not hidden, not controlled, only faced. The world had reached that moment. The reign of Cronus was no longer held together by strength. It was held together by resistance against collapse. And resistance cannot last forever. The pressure inside him had grown beyond silence. What he had swallowed was no longer passive. It had become presence that demanded release. And release, once it begins, cannot be stopped. Far below, Zeus stepped fully into what he had always been moving toward, not as a child hidden from fate, not as a force waiting to emerge, but as the one who would confront it. There was no single moment of declaration, no sudden shift from stillness to action, only transition, quiet, complete, inevitability becoming reality. Rhea moved as well. Rhea had waited through silence, through fear, through the slow build of everything that had led to this point. Now she acted, not in defiance alone, but in alignment with what could no longer be delayed. The confrontation did not begin with violence. It began with revelation. Cronus could no longer contain what he had taken. The presence inside him forced its way outward, not through destruction, but through release. One by one, the children he had swallowed returned to the world, not as weakened remnants, but as gods who had endured containment and emerged unchanged in their nature. The order he had tried to preserve was undone in a single irreversible sequence. His control had not prevented prophecy, it had ensured it. Zeus stood at the center of that unraveling, not as observer, but as cause. The world shifted around him, storm and sky responding in ways that could no longer be mistaken for coincidence. Power that had once been subtle now moved openly, not uncontrolled, but undeniable. Cronus faced what he had feared for all time, not an unknown force, but the consequence of his own actions. The future he had tried to destroy now stood before him, complete, unavoidable. The conflict that followed was not simply battle, it was correction, a realignment of a world that had been held in imbalance for too long. The Titans resisted, not out of certainty, but out of the instinct to preserve what had always been. But what has always been is not what will always remain. The war that followed reshaped everything. The sky itself seemed to fracture under the force of it. The ground responded. The seas answered. Nothing remained untouched by the scale of what was unfolding. And at the center of it all stood Zeus, no longer hidden, no longer forming, but fully realized as the force that would end one age and begin another. Cronus fell, not simply defeated, but replaced. The power he had tried to preserve through fear could not survive confrontation with inevitability, and inevitability had arrived. When the conflict ended, the world was no longer the same. The rule of Titans had broken, their certainty replaced with consequence, and from that consequence a new order emerged, not perfect, not without its own tensions, but different. Zeus rose not just as victor, but as ruler. The sky became his domain, not because it was given, but because it aligned with what he had become, a force tied to movement, to change, to power that could not remain contained. And yet, even in victory, something remained, a quiet truth beneath everything. That power gained through overthrow carries the memory of what it replaced. That fear does not disappear. It changes form, and the cycle that began with Cronus had not ended. It had transformed. Zeus had become what Cronus once was, a ruler shaped by prophecy, a god who now understood that control does not erase the future, it only delays it. And somewhere within that understanding, the next story had already begun